Okay, so thanks again. My name is Jacob Powell. I'm the local OSU Wasco County General Agricultural Extension Agent. I cover both Wasco and Sherman counties here in the Gorge, and have been trying to do more ag wildfire preparedness workshops over the last couple of years. Now that's such a emerging issue in our local cropping areas. So, kind of, my overall framework here for this afternoon, basically going to touch on how can we go about prioritizing where we put defensible space around our structures and on our farming property. Trying to expand defensible space that John touched on there and expanding that more to the field scale and kind of, a larger scale to what commercial ag producers are farming at these days. And then going to conclude with some fire suppression considerations and equipment things to think about that I think will help primarily with dryland wheat production. So where do we start prioritizing where we put in these defensible space areas? John did a good way of touching that often we don't have the resources or time to treat everything all at once. And so basically you just kind of need to make a list, and just each year, if you can start making progress, that's a step in the right direction. So here I'm trying to focus on where geographically should we focus on creating defensible space on the farm. And so we know that areas that have a south-facing aspect, those are going to dry out sooner in the fire season. Often our north-facing slopes might have more fields on them in some cases, but the south-facing slope is really going to get the most sun, and that's where fields are going to be the most receptive to fire if we have a wildfire that's occurring across our property. Also, the other concern is where's the dominant wind direction? It's interesting that here we've seen when the Eagle Creek fire happened, there was a dominant east wind that was blowing drier, warmer air from the eastern part of the state through the gorge at higher velocities with really gusty winds, and that really helped dry out the fuels to a greater extent. However, we've seen that a lot of the agricultural fires that have happened in the wheat fields here often happen when we have strong west winds. So often those west winds are bringing slightly cooler, moisture air, but once you're in eastern Oregon here, it's dry enough and the humidity is low enough that really doesn't matter if there's a little bit of added moisture in that air. The dominant fact is that we have these strong winds that are strong enough that are really going to fan those flames and make it difficult for us to control. Also, in areas that we have steep slopes, we need to consider creating an additional buffer, which also John Rizza touched on, that often we have to extend out that defensible space when we have a steep slope. And so basically thinking about this, where all three of these zones combine, that's really our priority zone that we need to focus on. And basically here's just a satellite imagery trying to help us kind of focus on this. So say this is your farm, and what we've got here is that, basically north is going straight up here. And so we've got to the east here, we have, looks like, primarily grassy fields going down this steep slope. And then we've got, we have some additional tree type fuels over here, but I'd say, our flashy fuels here are going to be our main concern. And let's say that this is, somewhere in the gorge that often during fire season, we have dominant west winds, not always, but often. So let's say the wind direction is the blue polygon here. This is our dominant wind direction on the property. We know we have a steep slope here going down into this drainage. So that would be a priority area to treat, because fire is going to be a lot more reactive if it's burning upslope towards our property through there. And then also where are our fuels the driest? So if we have a south-facing slope here, generally that would be in this region. Here you can see the aspect is not the dominant feature. It's not a really strong south aspect, but there's a slight south aspect. And so where all three of these zones interact, that's really the priority zone that we should focus on. And I know in this picture, this seems kind of smaller scale to be doing this, but I'm just using this as an example that, you could use this on a larger scale across your farm for sure. So now just trying to expand the things that John was talking about with defensible space in our structures, how do we expand that out at a more realistic farm scale? And so, farm shops are no different than the structures that John was talking about. And I just like this example that this is a fairly sturdy metal constructed building. You can see they have pretty clean gravel surrounding that building. That's going to create some good defensible space. There's some things here that, in agriculture, we're going to have fuel there for our equipment. So the fuel here, if that larger tank there is filled with fuel, this could be a concern. But, at least it's not right up against the building. But, things to think about, this could be a concern with the propane tank here, the diesel tank there. And it would also help, if it's not a gas tank, you're better off if it's just a diesel tank that won't be quite as explosive. The other thing here that I like is you can see they've got, this is obviously a field that's been harvested, but they definitely have mowed the stubble there. And I know it depends on your conservation contract with NRCS, what you can be doing with your stubble, but maybe it's worth mowing some of that stubble in just a few small areas around key farm infrastructure to help with later on in the fire season. And Rick raised his hand here. Go ahead, Rick.
Hey, Jacob, I'm sorry to jump in. I do a lot of site visits around structures for defensible space, both in kind of the urban interface, some of the timbered lands, and out in the agricultural lands as well. And folks ask a lot of questions about particularly their diesel and their propane tanks. Really, when we have conversations with folks about those on the kind of in person there, the only ways that those are real threats to anything is kind of either direct flame impact, on those things, and or impact from things that we aren't paying attention to. Propane tanks oftentimes are surrounded by gravel pretty well, but every once in a while, that's an area that we forget to weed eat, especially as you get busy in the spring and the harvest seasons. And so we'll negate that. But that's a great project for a teenager or anything like that that's around to make sure that those are clear. That way, there's no fuel source underneath them that's going to produce enough heat to cause their safety measures or anything like that to fail. The other thing that folks worry about is their diesel tanks. If there's any kind of leaking, that kind of stuff would be important to keep up on from all sorts of standpoints, from an OSHA standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, and then from a fire standpoint. But realistically, when they're located right up against the barn like that and they're surrounded by gravel, they're actually in a pretty good space. But I love the comment that you made about making sure that you're trying to keep that stubble shorter and create that buffer up against those gravel lots as well.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback, Rick. I don't quite know all the details on some of that, so I greatly appreciate you sharing that. So thank you. So kind of expanding this out a little bit further, again, obviously we have areas that there's hay being stored. And so we've really touched on the threat of ember spread. And so often you have to think about where are some of these embers going to land. And so preferably, if you have a tarp, preferably obviously a canvas type tarp that's not made out of synthetics, that might be something worth covering some of these areas with. That could be potential ember traps or potential fuel sources if an ember landed on it. And, preferably you put it in a barn. But again, even when you have feed stored in a barn, you're going to have to be aware of where ember is going to spread through this. And so in my mind, often this open barn here, something that could be considered is, do you have really large canvas tarps, not synthetic, some that are, somewhat fire resistant, that you could, potentially drape over some of these openings so that it would prevent embers from flying in and landing on that haystack and losing all your feed there. The other thing too is don't store all your feed so close together. So, I don't know the story with this photo here, but preferably these different stacks would be spread out, at least 100, 500 feet, maybe even preferably on different sites of your farm if possible. The other thing I'll note on this picture is that they kind of do have decent defensible space, though, when you look at the weeds that are spreading throughout here. So I'll touch on using vegetative fuel breaks later in this presentation. The idea is basically how can we intentionally put vegetation in an area that's going to have greater fuel moisture throughout the entire fire season than our surrounding vegetation. So, I'm not saying that fire wouldn't burn these weeds, but it would burn at a reduced rate of spread and with smaller flame lengths that you or other fire responders could easily get in here and suppress this fire safely if it was just in the weeds here. Obviously, if you look at a larger, canopy fire, there's a lot of oaks around here that could create a lot of embers that would impact the hay storage here. So that's something else to think about as well. Grain bed storage is another thing. I know in a lot of areas, this one on the right is in pretty good shape. You can see it's basically bare dirt around it. It's obviously one that's been in use. The ones here on the left, the producer might not actually be actively storing grain in these anymore, and so maybe this isn't a huge threat. But if you're actively storing grain in some of these grain bins, really think about defensible space around those, particularly when you have big sagebrush like this really tall stuff here. I mean, that's going to produce a lot of heat and a lot of tall flame lengths that could potentially impact what's being stored in these grain bins. Equipment storage is another big thing. Are we storing equipment in areas like this? There's a lot of grassy fields. If a fire were to go through there, it basically, impact all the equipment that's being stored there. So I really like this picture of, basically having that, fallow field, basically that you're just storing this equipment, and then it has very good bare mineral soil in several areas here. It's right next to the road. That's a good fuel break. And so this is a pretty effective place to store your equipment if possible. The other thing is with the spread of embers, a lot of research has been done in areas of Australia where in many areas, they're really trying to push people using basically windbreaks to help calm down the ember spread. And so instead of having embers flying in from everywhere, what if you had these basically these windbreaks that would help make it so that the wind wouldn't gust through and around your structures in certain areas on your farm. The only problem is when we think about windbreaks, we're adding a fuel source onto the landscape as well. And so I really want to point out in this picture, this is a picture in Hood River County. Again, typically we think of fire risk being somewhat lower in that area, but that's not to say that fires could happen, especially learned from the Eagle Creek fire. A lot of those orchard areas suddenly were almost under evacuation orders, which traditionally we don't think of that being an issue in those crops. But you can see here, kind of in the middle of the windbreak here, there's a lot of these juniper trees, which many wildland firefighters basically refer to as little green gas cans. And so whenever you've got these ornamental juniper trees, it's a big no-no anywhere near your structures. They produce a lot of heat, a lot of ember spread threat as well. I also just want to touch on firebrands or ember spread and agricultural fuel types. And so a lot of what the firebrands you're seeing here, this is on a prescribed burn I was on in Western Washington. And this is a lot of the bracken fern that was being consumed by the fire. And so different pieces of that fern are going up in the air and spreading. And so if these firebrands are not hot enough to actually start a fire, it's a lower risk. But when these firebrands get up into the smoke column and then the wind blows it, 100 feet away from the fire, if those embers are hot enough to start an additional fire, that's going to be a concern with spot fires that could start. And so there's a researcher at Oregon State University, David Plunk. He's actually in the engineering department that's done a lot of really interesting research in ember spread in some of these fuels that often we would associate with in more agricultural areas. So they found that, burning sagebrush, juniper, Douglas fir, and ponderosa pine, they found that sagebrush and juniper by far generated the most hot embers that could potentially spread multiple fires. And so the big takeaway with this is if you have areas that have a lot of sagebrush and juniper, you're going to have to think about increasing your defensible space to deal with some of these hot firebrands that can be coming off of those fuels when they're burning. And obviously it makes sense as moisture content increases, our firebrand starts to decrease. And so that's because when we have high moisture content, we can still have firebrands that are breaking loose, but often they're just smoldering and they're not actually actively burning and hot enough to actually start a fire with where they land. Also, the fuels that these embers are landing on also have higher moisture content. And so it's going to need more of a direct flame contact time frame for that fire to actually spread if it lands in fuels that are wet enough that they're not going to burn. And I just want to point out this small graph here that basically this graph is showing on the vertical axis the number of firebrands that were produced per dry mass that was being burned. So again, obviously different fuel types will generate different amounts of firebrands. And so basically they tried to correct this. And so, basically for 1 pound of sagebrush, how much embers are produced by that? Being the fact that, often sagebrush has less fuel to burn than, say Douglas fir, ponderosa pine. But even though it has a smaller amount that's being burned, it's creating more firebrands compared to the ratio of the area that's on it. And this also has tree height on it. So again, obviously tree height is going to be fairly small for sagebrush. But really what I'm trying to illustrate by this is you can see that the sagebrush compared to the tree species, the sagebrush actually had the most amount of firebrands being produced. And a lot of that is because of the chemical composition of the sagebrush, which Katie touched on. So again, just the sagebrush is really an area that often we don't think of firebrands or embers being an issue in agricultural fires, but if there's sagebrush in the area, even if it's fairly short sagebrush, it can still generate a lot of embers compared to other grassy fields in the area. So just to touch on here with goals of a fuel break, which Katie briefly touched on. So again, with creating a fuel break, we want to disrupt fuel continuity. So that's why obviously you have areas that have a gravel road, you're basically disrupting fuel continuity there. How do we then reduce fuel accumulations and volatility? So like I said, sagebrush really is concerned with ember spread. So reducing how much sagebrush we have in areas. Also with juniper trees as well. Don't forget they are also very volatile as well. And then how do we increase the proportion of plants with higher moisture in the area? So again, like a vegetative fuel break would do that. And then also remember that these fuel breaks, they also create a corridor that facilitates firefighter movement and also enhances their suppression activities. In a lot of areas, firefighters are not going to engage in the fire in that area if it's unsafe. So a lot of these fuel breaks, basically they just allow it so that the flame lengths are now below 4 feet and they can easily engage those directly with spraying water on them or even with hand tools in some locations. And so again, with this fuel break here, you can see this has been thinned. Both sides of the road here, they've removed the sagebrush. Like Katie said, though, you can see that it looks like there is some annual grass moving into the area here. So they still have also created another fuel issue that they will need to address for this to be a successful fuel break. And just considerations for, where you decide to put a fuel break on your farm potentially is the scale. How big of a fuel break do you need to be realistic to make a difference? Hopefully we're picking areas that we can put in a very short fuel break and make a big difference because of that. Be strategic in where we place these. I'll talk about this more later, but basically, in areas that it's flat terrain, the rate of fire spread is already going to be naturally reduced on the landscape. Or likewise, if we have a road that we can build that fuel break off of on either side, that's going to be a very strategic place to put it. And it's also very important that we make sure that this is economical. And so that's why hopefully we can get, cost share funding from the SWC or NRCS that's going to allow us to do these at an economical scale and make it so that we're getting some assistance with where we do these. So several different options, obviously. Prescribed burning is one that's been used in some areas. I don't think we're going to be doing that quite as soon here in some of these agricultural areas, but definitely chemical treatments, mechanical removal, seeding with perennial species, targeted grazing, mowing, or cutting. All these are considerations we can make. So one of the easiest solutions to create some of these fuel breaks is to use disking around some of our agricultural crops. And so this disc area probably would stop a fire. You can see they're still, they could maybe do this a second pass if they really wanted to clean it up, but this is definitely going to reduce the fire behavior that you would see in this area if a fire was occurring. Obviously also strategic, it's right next to the roadway here. So one strategy, instead of doing traditional tillage or disking, is doing turbotilling. So this is a picture of a turbotill implement here in Sherman County at the OSU experiment station. So the idea with using a TurboMax is that you're basically doing vertical tillage. And so you're basically spreading out the residue on the soil surface. And so this next picture will help. But you can see here, this does not look traditionally disked in the traditional horizontal sense, that we're not digging into the soil. We're leaving the residue on the soil surface, but we're just rearranging it on the surface. So a fire could still come through here and potentially burn through this. But the idea is that you could do this in strategic locations. And then if a fire were to happen, you'd come in here with your traditional disc and you would be able to clean this up with one pass instead of having to make multiple passes in your traditional residue. So in my mind, this is a way that we're still maintaining soil and water conservation to a higher extent than just traditional disking, but we're still being proactive in creating defensible space when we're using vertical tillage in some particular areas on your farm. And again, obviously there are agronomic concerns and considerations with doing this as well, but I just think it's a useful tool to use along field edges in many areas that we farm here. You can also do mowing to create basically defensible space or defensible buffers on your farm. So this is a winery / vineyard and mosier, and you can see here that they've throughout the summer they've kept this very short in case of a fire. Obviously, you can see very tall, dense ryegrass here in the background, very with the hillside back there, fire could easily come through here fairly quickly. It would be very hard for firefighters to get into your defend the property if it was not for this mowed field break here. The other thing too, they have a small sign here that even states that, this is not a parking area, this is a field break. So obviously in agricultural areas, sometimes we create mowed areas and people want to start parking their pieces of equipment or cars in those areas. So we want to deter people from doing that. Especially if the grass is this dry, you still don't necessarily want to be driving your grass vehicle through there just in case a spark were to fly. Grazing is another tool, as Catherine mentioned. And I just like this picture. This is near Mosier. You can just see the difference of the grazed inside the fence versus outside the fence where it's not been grazed. If a fire were to come through, this would be a fairly accurate and defensible safety zone. And it's going to protect the oak trees that are then within this grazed unit because those lower ladder fields have been grazed in this area. So perennial vegetative field breaks have been used successfully in parts of Southwest Idaho, particularly around Mountain Home and Boise, Idaho. And so this is just a picture of Forage Coach that's been used there. It's like Katie mentioned, Forage Coach is used by the BLM frequently to create some of these green vegetative field strips. So you can see here there the fire was burning through and it hit this field break with the Forage Coach and basically stopped. And you can see just how green this Forage Coach is. It obviously has a higher fuel moisture content than the surrounding annual grasses, and that's what makes it so successful. And in considerations for using this on agricultural properties, the nice thing is that once you get this established, you might have to go through and do some annual grass control during the establishment. But after that, basically, you can kind of walk away from it and will still be a good field break sitting there. Compared to if we think about mowing, grazing, or disking, those are practices that we have to do every single year to get ready for fire season. But if we can find a better perennial plant to use, such as this, basically once it gets established, we can walk away with it and focus on other areas of our farm to create defensible space, or just focus simply on farming on your operation. So here in Wasco County, I'm trying to implement some trials to see if Forage Coach will establish as well here as it does primarily in the Great Basin where it's been used in the past. And so these are some pictures of Forage Coach that I've been able to get successfully established here in Wasco County. And so you can see kind of, basic fuel arrangement here, obviously very green. In several cases here, it does a good job of expanding out and definitely has promise to help outcompete annual grasses in these areas. Yarrow is also a great species to use. So often around the region here in different conservation reserve program lands, they often get seeded into yarrow that establishes fairly well and successfully. It's also nice that it provides some pollinator habitat with the small flowering window that it has. And in general, I see yarrow on a lot of disturbed sites around the region here in North Central Oregon in CRP areas and other disturbed areas on the farm, which really suggests that, this could be a good, easy to establish species that would maintain itself on the landscape to help create a break in fuel continuity. So I will say with this trial, the Forage Coach that you see here was broadcast seeded in the spring. So just like all of you producers, I kept praying for rain last spring and finally got desperate that I just had to go out there and broadcast the seed that I had ordered. And miraculously, we did get some establishment in this particular strip. There was a irrigation leak in the field, which allowed some subsurface irrigation to this unique area. And so it was good to see that we actually got establishment of the Forage Coach and yarrow in this site. I also tried to seed in some flax. That was not as successful. We have not seen that come up yet. It may in the future. But, really, I think there's some promise with Forage Coach and yarrow in this area to create some of these perennial green strips with. And also just an update on this project, was able to go out there and drill seed this with the producer as well. Appreciate Diamond K Ranch allowing us to work on this project. And so we seeded some more last fall, and hopefully after all the snow and maybe some more spring precipitation coming soon, we will get some decent establishment that we can share more details with you on that in the future. So also thinking about defensible space at the farm scale, a good thing to think about is how can we create other areas and buffers using cash crops that you as a producer could get money for. And so in this region, some producers are growing canola, which that is a plant that it's an oil seed, so it's higher in seed oil content, but it also stays greener later into the fire season than our traditional winter wheat crops. And so is there a way that we could create borders around our wheat fields with canola, or sunflowers are also a good marketable crop that basically changes that fuel continuity on the landscape. We're all seeing that now that most of us are doing no-till agriculture, suddenly we get a lot of thick residue left on the landscape. Historically, areas were tilled that were fallowed, and so we had basically an effective fuel breaks on the landscape. Well, now we don't have those, and so we got to be more creative. And what are some other ways that we can still generate farm revenue, not have to go out there and disc areas, and still have a crop that we can harvest at the end of the year potentially? So this is a picture of canola versus dryland wheat being harvested. You can see both crops are fairly dry. But what I like about the canola is, yes, it's dry here, but you can see that there's increased space between the plants here compared to your traditional winter wheat field. When the substation wildfire happened in 2018 in Wasco County, actually burned through an area that they had been doing canola trials. And so the canola trial strips actually stopped the fire where it was burning through, compared to the areas of unharvested wheat. The fire, rapidly just burned through those areas, but actually stopped in some of these canola fields. And so that's why I think there's promise. Obviously, I'm not saying we have to grow whole fields of canola, but is there a way that we could, potentially use this in, 500-foot strips around our field borders? That could really help be a game changer in some of these areas, I think. And this is a comparison of canola versus wheat residue at harvest. Again, I just like how canola kind of disrupts that fuel continuity. A lot of sharp bamboo sticks here that you don't want to drive your four-wheeler through, but it does effectively improve and reduce wildfire risk in this area. Another tactic to consider is winter versus spring crops. This was a producer near Kent in Sherman County, and he had some ideas that he kind of want to be creative with, trying to do basically a spring wheat cover crop in some areas of his farm. Unfortunately, the large drought showed up last year, and as a result, he did not do as large of a cover crop trial with this as he had anticipated. But he did go out and basically do these strips of spring wheat. And this is basically right before winter wheat harvest. And so you can see that the spring wheat here is still very green compared to other areas of wheat that were about to be harvested. And so the spring wheat can burn eventually, but it kind of extends our safety areas later in the fire season compared to just using traditional winter wheat. Another thing too is that I like about this picture is, you would potentially do strips of this spring wheat in certain areas, maybe in your fallow field that you have a lot of residue on still. But do this in an area that makes sense, that you have the road right here, gravel road right here. The property owner or somebody at least had mowed this area here, and then you have the green strip here. And so that's a good kind of safety buffer that's being created here. Obviously, I think if you really wanted this for fire consideration, you would want this spring wheat crop right along the fence line here, and not 5 feet out there where you still have this burnable zone here. So just food for thought there.